Now, verse 17, there's a shift to the Jews. Now, Jewish people are going to be very upset about this harsh language. And they're going to say, well, we're with you when you talk about the Greeks, but you certainly don't mean us as well. So he says, indeed, you who are called a Jew and rest on the law and make your boast in God and know His will and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law. You therefore who teach one another, do you not teach yourself? And he starts to deal with hypocrisy. And he starts to deal with secret sins. And he starts to deal with the fact that those who parade their knowledge of the law of God are in fact guilty of breaking it right and left, even as they proclaim themselves to be apart from the wrath of God that comes upon the wicked. And it turns out that because they've been given the gift of law, they're more culpable than those who have not been given that gift, because they had knowledge that others didn't, and they still didn't turn to God in faith. But instead, look at how it begins in verse 17. You who are called a Jew and rest upon the law. And you see, they're resting on the law as a means of salvation. And this is the unlawful use of the law that I've talked about several times in the course of the semester. When God gave Torah, I've said this before, but let me just say it again. When God gave Torah, He gave it to a people who were already saved, so that the law was never given as a means of salvation. Keeping the Ten Commandments was never a means of salvation. The Ten Commandments, Exodus 20, were given to a people who had already come to faith. Exodus 14. Remember, we've been over that. And because of that chronology, we know that salvation was by grace through faith plus nothing. But by the New Testament period, Jewish people had completely misunderstood God's great gift to them, and they had turned the gift into a mechanical means of finding approval with God. And they turned it into boasting, that they boasted, we have the means of achieving salvation, and those wicked Gentiles don't know what we're talking about. Well, the problem was they didn't know what they were talking about either. And while they say one thing, they're doing another. And he says, when you say, do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? And here he's talking the same way Jesus does. Because it turns out that the thoughts and the plans that can lead to adultery are as bad as the actual action in God's view. Because God is not only looking at the overt act, but He's always looking at the inward heart, inwardmost person. And so the attitudes within the heart betray the person who pretends to be something he's not. This is why Jesus spoke about the self-righteous as whited sepulchres. He says, you're like a tomb that's been painted white, and you think the white paint makes the interior pure. But within, there's still putrefaction of the decay of the dead body. And just putting white paint on the outside isn't going to fix anything within. Now, he has to deal with, but what about the advantages they did have? And he said, circumcision, verse 25, is profitable if you keep the law. That is, if you're circumcised, and the circumcision, of course, was done to a person as a baby, so it wasn't his doing anyway. But when it was done to a person as a baby, and if that person grows up to be a pious person and a person with a real heart for God, then a person can say, look, my parents circumcised me and I'm living a life that reflects that. Well, that could be wonderful. But if you're a circumcised man who's sinning right and left, what good does that do you? Not much. And what if an uncircumcised man actually lives a life that is in relative scale superior to your life? Doesn't his uncircumcision count for more than your circumcision? And this just drives Jews crazy, but he's saying you have to look at the heart. And the focus is in verse 29. He is a true Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men but from God. Now here again, we have a case in which well-meaning preachers and Bible teachers want to twist an argument very strongly, and they'll say something that's not quite true. And they'll say what Paul is arguing here is that the real important thing is in the heart, and that's correct. It's absolutely correct. And then they'll say this is a New Testament emphasis, something unknown in Hebrew Bible, and that's not correct. Think about it if it were. Think about what it would mean if in the New Testament only God's interested in the real person, and in the Old Testament he was only interested in outward acts. What does that make of God? Something of a fool, doesn't it? If in Old Testament times God is only interested in the outer man, and then what were those 400 silent years? Well, was that God getting himself fixed so that he'd realize there's more? How do you do that? Well, you do that by not knowing the full Bible. So put something at Romans 2, will you? And let me show you that what Paul is teaching here is taught as strongly in Hebrew Bible as it's taught here. And a place is Deuteronomy, and it's chapter 10 and verse 12. And this is one of the great passages of Torah. I mean, this is one of the high points of the revelation of God through Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 10, beginning at verse 12. This passage, Moses raises the question, "And now, O Israel, what does Yahweh your God require of you?" So this is really important. What does God want from you? What is he asking from you? So here he's going to give it. So what does he want? Well, first, that you fear the Lord. Now remember, fearing God in the Old Testament doesn't mean to be afraid of God, but it means to hold him in awe and wonder and worship, and it is the equivalent of the New Testament expressions of saving faith, in which it is often used in parallel construction. An example we've seen in Exodus 14:31. So to fear Yahweh. Now, having come to faith, then what does God want? Well, you're to walk in his ways. And why are you to walk in his ways? Because you're going to love him, and you're going to serve him. Look at this, with all of your heart, with all of your soul, just as in the Shema. You shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Give it all you've got. And these statutes I'm giving you today, these are being given for your good. Did you notice that? When God gave the commandments to Israel at the beginning, they were not given to trouble their lives. They were given to help their lives work. We've gone through that. These laws gave opportunities for relationship with him and respect for one another, separation from their neighbors, an attractive force to the nations, and particularly instruction on worship. Remember all that? This is for your good. Now, how can God make the commands he does? Well, verse 14, heaven and the highest heavens belong to him. But verse 15, the second reason, not only because he's God and the creator and the controller of all, but verse 15, because of his love for the fathers. This is so powerful. Only avotecha, of your love, which Yahweh, avotecha, your fathers, Yahweh chashach, he embraced to love them, and he made his choice in them, and he took pleasure in them, and he laughed over them and enjoyed them. Now look at verse 16. Therefore, circumcise the foreskin of your heart. You see that? It's right there in Hebrew Bible. It's always true in the Bible, the outward act is to be a symbol of an inward reality. So an 8-year-old boy who's circumcised, he didn't have anything to do with that. That was something of his parents' faith and their obedience. But as that 8-day-old boy becomes a 13-year-old young man, and a 20-year-old adult, and a 30-year-old adult, that person is now to live out from his own inward desire that which his circumcision signified, a relationship with God. Therefore, he was to have a constant sense of spiritual discipline in his inner being. And that's what's signified by this expression, to be circumcised within. So the point is, it's right in the beginning. And when Paul says circumcision is that of the heart, he's not inventing something new, but this is a wonderful example of the unfolding of the rose. We talked about way at the beginning, remember? And we have something in Torah, and now we have it in an epistle. And now it's as clear as it possibly can be. So Paul is making it clearer. He's making it more manifest. But it's not that it was never there. It was already there in Torah. So in chapter 3 in Romans, back to Romans, well, what's the advantage of being a Jew? Is there any advantage? He said, well, yes, of course there are advantages. The advantages of being the people of God, through whom the promises were given, Torah was trusted to them, and you're the people who have had all of the great benefits through time, but you cannot rest on what your fathers and mothers believed. You have to come to faith yourself. And so then in verse 9, what he does is to argue for the universality of sin by quoting passages in Hebrew Bible that speak about sinfulness of Jewish people. So these come from the Psalms and the prophets, Isaiah. And these verses are just a collection. There are others he might have used, but these ones are really powerful. But these verses are not describing the sins of the Chaldeans or the sins of the Egyptians. These verses are describing the sins of Hebrew people. And Paul is doing something that's really powerful here in argumentation. He's using their own Bible, quoting passages that they knew were against their own people for their own sinfulness, so that it's an unarguable conclusion that under sin, they are all condemned. And that brings us to 3:20, and that's the end of this major unit. And so whether it's the overt homosexuality that Paul saw in Corinth, or whether it's the snide, prude, boorish behavior of one who's parading his relationship with God through Torah, but has never made an actual decision of faith, well, together they're condemned, and the wrath of God rests on them all, without exception. So that's this powerful unit. Righteousness is needed, and it's not going to be found as a surprise in a cereal box. Are any of you old enough to remember when cereal boxes used to have surprises? When I was a kid, I'd choose the cereal by the picture of the prize. And then I'd open the box and pour it in a bowl and half it go on the floor if it was a really good prize. And salvation doesn't come that way. It's not a prize in a box. We're all under sin. Verse 21 is so impressive in its contrast. But now, in the Greek text, nouni de. But now, the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed. And the wording here is really significant. The idea is it doesn't come about through the law, but it's witnessed by the law and the prophets. And the expression law and prophets is a way of talking about the whole of Hebrew Bible. On my Hebrew Bible, there are 3 words that mark the title in Hebrew. This page is in need of repair. The first word is Torah, and the second word is Nevi'im, that's prophets, and then the third word is Ketuvim, and that's writings. So when Jewish people speak of the Old Testament, sometimes they'll say Tanakh, and that's T-N-K, Torah, law, Nevi'im, in, prophets, K, writings, T-N-K, and they abbreviate that in that manner. Well, Paul, here in saying law and the prophets, is using an even shorter form. It's law and prophets and writings, but sometimes we just say law and prophets, and it's a way of talking about the whole Bible. So he's saying that righteousness didn't come from keeping the law, but the whole Hebrew Bible talked about the revelation of the coming of the righteousness of God, which is through faith in Jesus Christ. And then notice it says to all, and on all who believe. In other words, and on all are problematic, but dropping them doesn't matter. It's still the same point. Through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. Now notice that to all who believe. That takes us all the way back to Romans 1:16, where he says, to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Now he says, for there's no difference in this passage, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Now the no difference there means there's no difference between Jewish people and non-Jewish people. There's no difference between those who think they're righteous and those who know they're not, because all have sinned. And Romans 3:23 is part of your memory pack when you join the Navigators. And now you see it in the flow of this passage and how very important it is. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's epexegetical. All have sinned. The word sin in the New Testament, the Greek word here is a very common word, hamartia, and it means to miss the mark. It's a verb here. And it means, it's an archer's term. The archer is drawn the bowstring, notch the arrow, drawn the bowstring, let the arrow fly, and it doesn't hit the target. And the target is the righteousness of God. No one hits it. But it's not only that the arrow doesn't hit the intended target, the arrow does hit something. And what it hits is wrong. See? So it's not just you've missed, it's also you've hit the wrong thing. So it's both omission and commission. And when it goes on to say, and fall short of the glory of God, that's just explaining slightly different words what the verb is already mentioned. But now look at how we're justified. Freely by His grace, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. I mean, these words are among the most wonderful in all the New Testament, aren't they? Now, speaking of wonderful words, there are some technical words in the book of Romans that we need to remind ourselves of. Sin is described in a wide variety of ways, and sin includes, we've seen, sexual immorality. That includes idolatry, vile passions, a debased mind. But sin also is missing the mark. So it is both the awful actions as well as the actions that aren't quite good enough. So sin is both the worst and not the best. Did you get that? Sin is both the worst that we do, but it's also not the best. My teacher, Dr. Ryrie, used to say that many people just have the idea that Satan's goal is for a person to be the most debased, diseased, depraved, demonic, individual the planet has ever seen. Dr. Ryrie said that's actually someone who's gotten out of control. That what Satan really wants is someone who looks pretty good, but isn't good enough. Because if he looks pretty good, he's going to feel pretty good about himself, and he's going to be fooled that he's better than he is, and he'll think he's good enough, and there's no good enough. So sin includes the worst things that we do, but it also is missing the mark, and it means we are not doing the things that we ought to do. Justification in the book of Romans, in chapter 4, is the idea of declaring righteous. And we've anticipated this already. To justify is where God declares someone righteous. Now, it's very important when you think of an American court trial. Here's a defendant, and the charges have been made, and the prosecutor makes his case, and the defense attorney makes her case, and then the jury renders a decision, and the jury may decide innocent, or the jury may decide guilty. In God's court, there is one decision, guilty. Every single one, guilty. God says of no one, save Jesus, God says of no one innocent. But then God is able to turn a guilty person into a justified person. And the justified person is a guilty person whom God declares to be righteous. It's the declaration of God. And the first time we find that in the Bible is, of course, clearly in the Bible, is in Genesis 15:6 about Abraham, which we've talked about before. Now, in this passage, we have the word propitiation. And this is a technical word that you do need to know because it's a part of theological discourse. It's a word that's very important. When Jesus died on the cross, a number of things transpired. In fact, more than we know or will know. But one of the things that happened that is very, very important, when Jesus died on the cross, God was fully satisfied. And that's what's meant by propitiation. The word propitiation actually is the word hilasterion, and it's a word that is the Greek word for the mercy seat that was in the tabernacle and then in the temple, and that's where the high priest would sprinkle blood on Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. But the idea of propitiation is that God has been completely satisfied. Now, in Roman Catholic theology, the idea is God is not quite satisfied. Well, the problem with that is we have a different theology than the Roman Catholic Church has. And that different theology came about during the Reformation. It became defined then. And when Luther discovered justification freely by grace through faith, the Counter-Reformation fixed the worst of what Luther fought against. See, when Luther was first articulating his ideas, there were some who were won by him. After all, it wasn't that, the world was divided instantly, Lutheran and Catholic. I mean, it was Luther alone. And then he won other Catholics to his view. That's what the church was in the West. And so as he won person after person, well, there was the possibility that he could have convinced the leaders in Rome that he was right. And there were probably some leaders in Rome that were sympathetic to some of Luther's ideas. I assume that was the case. But what happened is when Luther went his way, then the Roman Catholic Church officially went the other way. And that was the Counter-Reformation. And in the Counter-Reformation, the church in Rome made decisions that were inimical to the decisions that were made by Luther and his colleagues. And Luther's view is propitiation. God was fully satisfied. The official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church from the Counter-Reformation onward is that the death of Christ satisfied God partly, but it takes the righteous acts of a Christian to bring about the rest of the satisfaction that God needs. So, your salvation, the Roman Catholic Church teaches officially, is based both on the work of Christ, who pays the larger amount of the deal, and your righteous actions that make up the deficit that the death of Christ did not accomplish. And together, then, you can come to a full appeasement of God. The problem is that so many Christians fall so far short in their Christian life of achieving that which would bring satisfaction to God, that they had to develop an idea of how you can get rid of the sin that still lingers with you, that has to be purged away. And so they invented something that's not in the Bible, but they invented purgatory, a place of purgation, so that a person who's confessed faith in Christ, has kept the sacraments, and has lived a fairly good life, may not have to spend as much time in purgatory as a mafia leader who is baptized but who's killed and run, dens of iniquity and who knows what kinds of awful things. But that person will still go to heaven eventually. It's just going to take a lot of years in purgatory for that person to work things through. So it still works righteousness, isn't it? So the reason that Benedict XVI will not be able to bring the church all together under his umbrella is that it's not just that he wears robes and we don't wear robes. It's because there's a different theology. And our theology is based on Christ paid it all. And that is so wonderful that we have no desire whatever to go back to that teaching that says, well, Jesus really paid a lot of the bill, but he left a pretty good amount for us to work on ourselves. See? Look what this verse says. God set forth as a propitiation by his blood, through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, so that it's all of God. Now, the word salvation is another technical term in the book of Romans. And the Greek word means deliverance. There is also a word that means preservation. That is a use of the word that means preservation. And but Paul uses the word salvation in the sense of something being completely set free, something that is completely rescued. The deal is done, and God has done it. And because the deal is done, and because God has done it, look at what we have in verse 27. There's no reason for boasting. And that's the same thing Paul said in Ephesians when we were reading Ephesians chapter 2. Do you know, if we could say, yes, Jesus died for my sins, but I was smart enough to exercise faith, then I would be boasting in my faith. And Paul says you can't even boast in your faith. For even your faith is not of yourselves, lest anyone should boast. When it comes to salvation, it's all of God. So there's no boasting. It's excluded. You can't boast because you've kept the law. You can't boast because you've done works. All you can do is conclude that a person is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law. And because of that, we celebrate our salvation as the gracious gift that God has given, and it's not something we've achieved or something we've earned. It's certainly nothing we deserve. Okay? So salvation is by grace through faith, plus nothing